This is a very, very familiar gospel. So much so that I think we have a temptation when we hear it. We think, oh, it's a story of the Good Samaritan, how nice. And then we sort of let our thoughts get distracted. So what we need to do, I think, is to try to listen to it with new ears. Try to see what really is going on here in this gospel, because it may not be what we have been accustomed to think. Even the name, Good Samaritan. Whenever we think of Good Samaritan, we think of somebody we think positively of it. A person who is good and kind and generous and helpful, even going out of his way to even perhaps give of his own resources or even risk something in order to help another. That, whenever we think of Samaritan, that tends to be what we think of. What would the people who were listening to Jesus have thought when they heard the word Samaritan? You may remember in the gospel a couple of weeks ago, we had Jesus up in Galilee, beginning his journey with his disciples to Jerusalem from Galilee. The shortest option to go from Galilee to Jerusalem was to pass through Samaria, the territory of the Samaritans. They started to do that. Jesus sent several scouts ahead to secure a place in a village, and the people of that Samaritan village refused to offer Jesus hospitality. And so he couldn't go there. In fact, John, the disciple, said, "Let's cast down fire on them and destroy them for their inhospitality." And Jesus, in a very, very strong way, rebuked him. Said, "No, that's not how we work." So, in this journey, they got off to a little bit of a rocky start with the Samaritans. They had to go around, probably down to the Jordan River, a kind of an arduous descent going along the river, could have its own dangers, and then needing to go back up when they get to Jericho, near Jerusalem. If any of you have been to the Holy Land, you kind of are familiar with that route and that territory. So, a little bit further on the journey, he sends his disciples out to proclaim the gospel to neighboring towns. And they come back, and they had a tremendous amount of success. That's what we heard last week. And Jesus says to them, "To you is given the secret of the kingdom of heaven." It's kind of an important statement. What was omitted from last week's gospel was where Jesus talks about, in fact, he sounds more like he sounds in John's gospel than in Luke. He's talking about how the Father has revealed everything that God is to him. The Father, in other words, has shared his very godness with Jesus. That's why we can speak of him as the Son of God. Everything that belongs to God the Father belongs to Jesus. And now Jesus is sharing that with his disciples. There's a little insight into that given in our first reading, which is from the Old Testament law, the book of Deuteronomy, where Moses is telling the people who had just received the Old Testament law, the Torah, he's telling them, keep this law. Do what this law tells you, and you will be faithful to God, and God will be faithful to you. You don't have to make a big journey. You don't have to go to some special place or seek special wisdom. It's all here, everything that you need. Keep the law, and you will be assured of your relationship with God. Now, one of the lawyers, the people who professionally studied the law of God, and of course, as we know, among professionals, what do professional academics like to do more than anything else? What do professional academics like to do? Teachers, professors, scholars, what do they like to do more than anything else? Argue. Argue, because each one will have his own insights into what they're studying. And they think their way of looking at things is better than the other professors. And so, if any of you have ever been involved in any kind of academic endeavor, you know how professional academic jealousy is usually the motivation for an awful lot that they do. So, this scholar of the law basically comes to Jesus and does what he likes to do: provoke an argument. What do I have to do to gain the kingdom of heaven? Well, at one point, Jesus said, do you know the law? You know the commandments, keep them. But Jesus says to him, what is the greatest of the commandments? It boils down to two. Love God above everything, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the scholar of the law says, yeah, you got it. That's right. That's what I would have said. And Jesus says, do this and you will live. But the question wasn't finished yet. And Luke gives it a little bit of a negative twist when he says the scholar was trying to test Jesus. Maybe so, but I think he was probably just trying to provoke an argument, a typical academic fight, to say, well, yes, but. So what was that yes, but? Who is my neighbor? And that, you stop and think about it, that's a perfectly logical question. Because most people, when they heard that, love your neighbor as yourself, thought, well, okay, my neighbor is the people of my household. My neighbor are the people of my neighborhood, of my town, of my village. My neighbor is the people who belong to the same clan or faction as I do. My neighbor is a fellow Democrat or a fellow Republican. And those on the other side, they're not my neighbor. And my neighbor is a fellow Catholic. They would have said a fellow Jew. But, among Jews, you've heard the expression, and this is a good Jewish joke that Jews themselves like to tell. When you have two Jews talking about anything, you will have three opinions. And that's kind of the way things were. Jews then were divided up into factions. We know just 4 major sects among the Jews. It wasn't like they were a unified religion. No, there were at least 4 major sects among them: Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. And those are the major ones. And each one had a whole bunch of minor sects. That we'll come to in a moment. So, with all of this division, really among a people who shared a basic faith, shared a basic identity, there was also a group of real outsiders. They were like Republicans would be for Democrats, or Democrats would be for Republicans. They were Samaritans. They had the same origin as the Jews, but they were regarded as traitors. There's a historical reason for that, but they didn't trust each other. And the Samaritans lived in that territory between Judea, where Jerusalem was, where Bethlehem was, and Galilee, where Nazareth and Capernaum and all of those other places that we associate with Jesus were. The Samaritans were right in between. And the one thing that characterized their relationships with each other was mutual distrust and mutual hatred. So when this scholar of the law asks Jesus that question, "Who is my neighbor?" he was expecting Jesus to define it, maybe not just in terms of my own party, my own faction, Pharisees, Sadducees, and so on, but maybe he was going to at best say, well, everybody who believes in the one God the way that we do, everybody who worships at the temple in Jerusalem, that's your neighbor. Expand your horizons. So let's look at what Jesus said in the light of what that scholar of the law might have been expecting. Put yourself in his position. So Jesus tells a story. A man was going from Jerusalem to Jericho. It wasn't a long journey, but it was a very precarious journey. It was a difficult journey because you had to go down a winding, twisting road that had a steep descent down from somewhere around, I think, 1,000 feet above sea level to 2,000 feet below sea level. It was a deep descent. There were a lot of caves and nooks and crannies for, guess who, to hide in? Thieves, robbers. You were very vulnerable to being attacked, mugged, beaten, robbed if you went down there alone. Apparently, this man, a Jew, a good Jew, probably a wealthy Jew, a prosperous Jew, because he would probably be going down on business, was apparently either going alone or he had been abandoned by the caravan that was accompanying him. But anyway, he was beaten by the robbers, everything he had was taken, and he was left for dead by the side of the road. Now, who should come by? Two professional holy men. One was a priest, the other a Levite. We don't have to bother about the distinction between the two. There was a distinction, but why would they not come to that person's aid? Probably they were going to the temple and had an official job to do in the temple. And if they touched blood or touched a dead body, they would be rendered for a certain period of time ritually unclean. The job that they were going to do, they would not be able to perform. So they had reason. In fact, they had what they thought was a good reason to bypass this man who was clearly dying, maybe already dead, by the side of the road. Basically, what would be in their mind, I can't do this because I'm on my way. The equivalent would be what? I'm on my way to say Mass. They depend on me. And if I help him, I won't be able to do my duty. So they pass him by. Now, I kind of think that what the scholar of the law and what the people who are listening to Jesus, what they would be thinking at that time was, okay, that means an ordinary Jew will come by. Maybe a Pharisee, because they were the best of the Jews. Maybe an Essene, because they acknowledge themselves as the best of the Jews. Maybe one of the other factions. So what Jesus seemed to be getting at was maybe broadening the level of what it means to be neighbor from the professional level, the priest and Levite, to an ordinary person who obviously would pour his heart out at the sight of this poor man. But the next one to come by was a Samaritan. Now, Jesus and his disciples had just had an unfavorable experience with Samaritans, and that was to be expected. Everybody knew that the Samaritans hated the Jews, and everybody knew that the Jews hated the Samaritans. What does a Samaritan do? The hated Samaritan? He goes over, binds up his wounds, pours oil on them, puts them on his beast of burden. He must have been a fairly wealthy person to have a beast of burden. So we would say put him in the back of his SUV and drove him to the nearest inn, where he leaves a fairly substantial amount of money, 2 silver coins, with the innkeeper. Take care of him. I'll check in on him on my way back, and if you incur any further expense, I will repay. Now, that, we can't emphasize this enough, that shocked his hearers. And the last thing that Jesus says was, who was neighbor to the man who fell among robbers? We would expect him to put it a different way. And that is, which one saw the man who fell among robbers as his neighbor? But he puts it the other way, that the Samaritan acknowledged that the Jew who fell among robbers was his neighbor. He says it was the Samaritan who broke the stereotype and behaved in a neighborly way to somebody that he had reason to hate. So what would your reaction be when Jesus asks the question, who Actually, I'm going to keep the level at what it was and turn it off. I hope that you can still hear me. So what would be your reaction when Jesus asked the question, who was neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? Well, I think if you're anything like me, it would catch in my throat. Reluctantly, I wouldn't say, as the man didn't say, oh, the Samaritan was. He said, the man who showed mercy. That's when Jesus says, go and do likewise. Now, here is the thing. Jesus isn't telling us what to do. Jesus is telling us how to think about one another. In other words, he wasn't giving a formula for how we are supposed to come to people's aid. He's giving us an insight into how we are to look at one another, which becomes the basis for how we treat one another. So, in many other places, Jesus says, love your enemies. Do good to those who persecute you. Pray for those who hate you. Here, he's giving a concrete example of what it means to love your enemies. Not just to do good for somebody, but how to love your enemies. How to make your enemy, not to make your enemy your neighbor, but how to be a neighbor to your enemy. Now, what's the practical bottom line here? That we have to go out and look for people who are our enemies and sort of grovel before them and that sort of thing? I don't think so. I think rather it is the first thing we have to do is to pray for them. I'd like to make a suggestion, and I made it to myself because I wasn't doing this. But I think I'm making it to myself, and I've started doing this. Start every day thinking about your enemies, not about your friends. Don't worry about the people right now that you find it easy to love. You will love those. Pray that the Lord may show you and me how, in a practical way, to love our enemies, to love the person who is trying to hurt you, to love the person who hates you, to love the person who is alienated from you, whether that is in your individual relationships or in our society and in our world. Maybe the people who are our enemies in society, in the world, are that because we're not praying for them. Did you ever think about that? Thomas Merton one time made the statement that, and this was back in the 1960s when we were very afraid of nuclear war. We probably should be afraid of that now, but that's another question. But back in the 60s, when it just seemed to be imminent, Thomas Merton made the statement, if the nuclear bomb falls tomorrow, it will be because we did not love our neighbor today. I think there's still something to be said for that. How do we love our neighbor? Number one, pray for them. Pray not, Lord, straighten them out, but pray, Lord, they are your children. Help me to learn how, in a practical way, in a real way, to show your love for them. I don't know how to love them. Help me. Show me how. I think if we were to begin every day with that kind of prayer, calling to mind some of the specific people that we have problems with, if we were to begin every day with that prayer, our day would begin to look different, wouldn't it? And when our day begins to look different because of praying for our enemies and seeking to learn how to love them, I think our world will begin to look different as well.
A reading from the book of Good Samaritan. Moses said to the people, if only you would heed the voice of the Lord your God and keep his commandments and statutes that are written in this book of the law, when you return to the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul. For this command that I enjoin on you today is not too mysterious and remote for you. It is not up in the sky that you should say, who will go up in the sky to get it for us and tell us of it, that we may carry it out? Nor is it across the sea that you should say, who will cross the sea to get it for us and tell us of it, that we may carry it out? No, it is something very near to you, already in your mouths and in your hearts. You have only to carry it out. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
A reading from the letter of St Paul to the Colossians. Christ Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him were created all things in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he himself might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile all things before him, making peace by the blood of his cross, through him, whether those on earth or those in heaven. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
There was a scholar of the law who stood up to test him and said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" He said in reply, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." He replied to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." But because he wished to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man fell victim to robbers as he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. They stripped and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the road, but when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. Likewise, a Levite came to the place, and when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. But a Samaritan traveler who came upon him was moved with compassion at the sight. He approached the victim, poured oil and wine over his wounds, and bandaged him. Then he lifted him up on his own animal, took him to an inn, and cared for him. The next day, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper with the instruction, "Take care of him. If you spend more than I have given you, I shall repay you on my way back." Which of these 3, in your opinion, was neighbor to the robber victim? He answered, "The one who treated him with mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." The Gospel of the Lord.